Hey, we can start. Good morning, everyone, on this Friday morning. Welcome to the PCC Energy Dialogue on green hydrogen. I'd like to welcome our facilitator as well as our panelists to this energy dialogue. My name is Simpiwe Ngwenya, and I am a program manager within the mitigation team of the PCC. And I would like to introduce our facilitator. Her name is Commissioner Joanne Yawich. Joanne wears several hats. She is a commissioner of the PCC, and she is also a commissioner of the Net Zero Working Group, but also she heads up the JET IP project management unit that is leading the implementation plan of the JET IP. So I've been tasked with providing a brief background on this dialogue, and this dialogue on green hydrogen really emanates from a series, I guess, stakeholder concerns, in that when we had our first series of energy dialogues that focused mainly on power and the integrated consultations that took place this year on the electricity recommendations, as well as the JET IP, stakeholders raised several concerns about green hydrogen and what is green hydrogen? What is the role of green hydrogen within the just energy transition? And I guess in the context of industrialization and the just development of this particular industry. And this is why we're having this discussion today. It's a very important discussion. I think this is a really crucial industry for our economy, in particular as it relates to the future and the net zero future of the country. With that said, I am going to hand over to Commissioner Joanne Yawich to lead the discussion and the facilitation for today. Thank you.
Thanks, Simpiwe, and welcome to everybody on the line. I see that we are up to around, the numbers are increasing all the time, but they're already around 80 people online. We've got around 2 hours, and I would really like us to have as much time as possible for engagement, both between and among the panelists as well as with yourselves. Please, could we ask all of you to post your questions and your comments in the Q&A in the Q&A box, and then the panelists, as we go along, will also try to respond to them. But they will also be monitoring the Q&A and be addressing some of the issues that you raise. As Simpiwe has indicated, the purpose of this engagement really does come out of, I think, a kind of debate that is happening in the Presidential Climate Commission on the role of green hydrogen in South Africa's move to a lower carbon and more climate resilient society. And I'm sure that all of you will know that we are holding this dialogue in the wake of the Green Hydrogen Summit that happened in Cape Town earlier on this week, and also following the adoption by Cabinet of the Green Hydrogen Commercialization Strategy. And so I think a very strong and clear signal from government that it intends to pursue and to develop green hydrogen as an economic sector in South Africa. But I think equally on the other side, quite a significant set of concerns from civil society in particular about what the role of green hydrogen is, whether there has been adequate consultation, what the implications are for workers, what the job creation potential is of the industry, how this can become an industry that is inclusive, and what the benefits are. So how is justice going to be embedded in the way that a green hydrogen economy in South Africa is rolled out? Also questions, I think, about the balance between an industry that is benefiting South Africa at a domestic level and an industry for exports. And I'm sure the panelists are going to deal with all of that. We have an eminently qualified panel to address these issues. The way we're going to proceed is firstly 2 inputs by Dr. Rebecca Masarumule, who's the Chief Director from the Department of Science and Innovation, who has been for many years now working on this issue. And secondly, a presentation on the green hydrogen commercialization strategy from Mr. Mahendra Ruplal, who's an industry development planner at the IDC. So we'll have those 2 presentations, followed by an input from Commissioner Bobby Peake, who's a director at Groundwork and who's going to speak on behalf of civil society. And then we'll have 3 industry panelists to join the other 2, and we'll try and take a collective conversation. So I think without further, and I see that people are introducing themselves in the chat. That's fabulous. I think if everybody could, it would give us a very good idea about who we are and who's talking to whom in this room. So without further ado, can I ask Rebecca to do the framing and the contextualization around green hydrogen in South Africa? Over to you, Rebecca.
No, thank you, Joanne. Simpiwe, could you project my slides?
Yes, I have that. Just please give us a second.
No worries. So while I'm waiting for the slides to come forward, I'm hoping by the end of my talk you understand 2 things. One, that government is making progress, and I'm not just saying that because I'm a government official, but I truly feel that the government is working together across different departments as well as with industry to create an enabling environment. I'm going to give you a slide that shows where we're making progress, but also to let you know that really part of what needs to happen is the South African voice actually needs to start being heard in international forums. If we're not, a lot of the evidence base that's created for policies is being created in international organizations, and then moving through certain processes, and those processes are going to have huge impact on what we want to do in South Africa. So in terms of next slide. So I do have a new role or position. I'm Chief Science and Technology Representative, focusing on issues of hydrogen and vaccines. But today I'll talk about the work I'm doing in vaccines. So if you look at what's happening globally, in the most recent Hydrogen Global Review that was published by the IEA, a total of 41 governments have some type of strategy in place for hydrogen. And some of them are early movers who have actually updated their strategies, raising ambitions. But really, there's a consensus across the world that low emissions hydrogen is actually critical for decarbonizing the world, especially for hard to abate sectors. And when I'm talking about low emissions hydrogen, this is hydrogen that could be produced from coal gasification, but uses carbon capture and storage. Hydrogen produced from steam methane reforming, but you use carbon capture and storage, and clean hydrogen, which you call as water electrolysis, that comes from solar, wind, and other renewables. I think it's also important to note that the move towards a net zero economy actually has created quite a bit of momentum for the hydrogen economy and the demand in general. And you'll see strategies across the world. You have US recently published one. You have Japan. You have Germany. South Africa's mentioned. Singapore recently launched a strategy. So there's a bit of coherence towards that's working globally. But each of these strategies have something in common, which is moving towards a low net zero economy. They're expecting a lot of opportunities for investment, economic growth, job creation, and last but not least, just transition. Next slide. And really, if you look at a lot of the international initiatives, there's the Hydrogen Energy Ministerial in Japan, which is ran by Japan to really try to increase the targets around hydrogen and fuel cells. So I think 10-10-10 is, 10 million fuel cells on the ground within 10 years, which is 2030, and so forth. You have the International Partnership for Hydrogen and Fuel Cells in the Economy, Intergovernmental Organization, looking at issues around safety, standards and codes, education outreach, as well as facilitating and harmonizing opportunities for trade. The Hydrogen Council, which started a few years ago on the sidelines of the World Economic Forum, is now, I think, growing to about 150 companies, which are globally the largest producers, consumers, and users of hydrogen across the whole entire value chain. And then you have the IEA Technical Collaboration Program, which is looking at, working together on R&D and looking at the actual techno-economic analysis around moving towards cleaner hydrogen, clean energy minister, and so forth. So this is just a high-level snapshot of what's going on. And South Africa is actually participating in quite a few of these initiatives. IPHE, Hydrogen Council, you have companies like Sasol, Anglo are members, Clean Energy Ministerial through the DMRE, as well as the International Energy Agency through the DMRE. We are actually a partner country at the IEA. Next slide. So I think one of the things I think is in terms of low emissions projects. So globally, there's been a lot of hype going on. Every other week, there's a new conference, there's a new announcement of what's going on. But now, and we can maybe call, I think a few weeks ago, I was at a conference where the deputy minister or the deputy secretary of energy called this the golden era for hydrogen. But the challenges we're facing now is that only 4% of the potential production projects are going towards final investment decision. So this is 4%. And I would hope that I hope this would, you would want this to be a typo, but it's not. Only 4% of projects. And what's happening is now we're starting to lose credibility. And if you start losing credibility, then you're really not going to see the change that happen. So the recommendations for improving the situation and moving forward are fostering international cooperation to accelerate solutions of hydrogen certification and mutual recognition of certificates, addressing regulatory barriers, especially for project licensing and permitting, supporting project developers to maintain momentum during the inflationary period to extend regional reach, and then taking bolder action to stimulate demand creation for low emissions hydrogen, particularly in existing hydrogen uses. So this could be in refineries, it could be in another sector. So I think that as South Africa, we are at risk for being part of this club of countries that are failing in this statistic around a final investment decision. And the question is, what do we do about that? Next slide. So I think the first thing is this thing of coherence of communication. So this is a recent report released by the IEA at the G7. And really what this report says is that, greenhouse gas emissions is in the production routes and needs to be, you need to review ways of understanding how much hydrogen, how much greenhouse gas emissions is in 1 kilogram of hydrogen. And I think this thing is, we need to move away from color. So green versus gray versus blue, turquoise, I heard purple the other day. This is actually creating challenges. So we need to move towards an agreed emissions accounting framework for how much greenhouse gas emissions is in a kilogram of hydrogen, and really even the boundaries. So is it from the production site to the door when the hydrogen leaves, or do you include how the hydrogen moved to that place where it's being used, which means you're going to add greenhouse gas emissions if you move it in a diesel truck versus a truck that moves with hydrogen. And this has implications for CBAM and so forth, but also is holding back our ability to put in place contracts that underpin investment. And then also an adoption of a common framework that is transparent will enable investments in the development of international hydrogen supply chain. So this is some work that's coming out internationally. Next slide. And really, in terms of international engagements around standards and certification, South Africa is actually very actively involved. We're a member of the Regulations Code Safety Standards Working Group under the IPHE through the Department of Science and Innovation. Our Department of Fisheries, Forestry, Fisheries, and Environment is a part of the Hydrogen Trade Task Force on Hydrogen Production Analysis. And it has produced international reports, which are actually informing ISO standards that are coming out around hydrogen. And last but not least, there's a task force on hydrogen trade rules. Recently, South Africa is now co-leading that task force with the Netherlands. So I think this opportunity to have our voice heard in these international forums is really important, because a lot of these things are adopted by ESO and in the different organizations which work internationally. Next slide. So in terms of progress, could you hit next slide? So the hydrogen RDI strategy was approved in 2007. Next slide. The green transport strategy was approved in 2018. Next slide. The Hydrogen Society Roadmap was approved in September 2021. Next slide. The Just Transition Framework was approved 2022. Next slide. The South Africa Renewable Energy Master Plan was released for comments, I think, early this year. Next slide. And I'm proud to say that the Green Hydrogen Commercialization Strategy was approved, I think, 2 days ago in October 2023. So for me, I think that this is really exciting that we as a country and government are moving towards coherence and putting in place the policies required to move us in the right direction. So I'm just proud to see this slide because often you don't really see a situation where you're moving so quickly. So next slide. So I think what's next? So we know that the South African Bureau of Standards actually has a local steering committee on hydrogen standards and certification. So I think it's critical that we support SCBS, as well as ensuring that South African voice is heard, that the SCBS work is actually being implemented, or at least informing what's happening on the international stage. Also, I think, we're very proud of the Green Hydrogen Commercialization Strategy, but I think really if we're going to be proud, we need to support IDC and DTIC towards the implementation, because this will allow us to actually move our green hydrogen, green ammonia, green steel to other countries. And I think this is around funding or other opportunities that the DTIC and IDC needs. And then as we move towards more coherence in the organizing of the triple helix relationship to support the hydrogen economy in South Africa, we need to position ourselves internationally. So I think we need more coherence, and I think PCC has done a great job in terms of ensuring that climate change work in South Africa has been well organized. I think as government and academia and private sector, we also need a similar structure for the hydrogen economy so we can move forward properly. Next slide. Thank you so much. I hope I kept to time.
Thank you, Rebecca. You did indeed, and I think that thanks very much for I think locating where we are as a country, and particularly where we are as a government in terms of all of the work that has been done. And I'm sure that we are going to come back later on to engage with these issues. I'm going to ask Mahendra if you can put up your slides and take us through them. Thanks, Mahendra.
Thank you, Joanne. Can you see the slides in presentation format?
We can.
Okay.
Thanks.
Thank you for that. Thank you for the introduction, and thank you, Rebecca, for the context. That was, I think, indeed wonderful for you to provide that. So I've entitled the presentation "A Path Towards Industrialization and Decarbonization for South Africa." I'm happy to be presenting this to you. I've been working in this industry for the past 6 years, and it's an area that I'm quite passionate about. Sorry, let me just move to the next slide, if it allows me to. So let's talk a bit more of the history that Rebecca mentioned. And I think she's very modest because if it wasn't for DSI, we wouldn't have been where we are today. She mentioned the 2007 hydrogen strategy. A lot of demonstration projects happened in the next 10 years. More recently, we're moving into the commercialization phase. Rebecca mentioned the Hydrogen Society Roadmap. Then I think also the JET IP inclusion of green hydrogen is quite important. Presidency also identifying it as one of the big 5 frontier strategic investments. And very recently, we published the commercialization strategy for comments. And thereafter, we updated the document with the public comments. We listened to what the public had to say, made the necessary changes, and took that back to cabinet. And that was then approved just this Wednesday. So moving on, I think it's really, really important to look at this value chain, especially from the just energy transition perspective. So understanding the value chain and the applications is quite important in that regards. And these applications that I've included, there's more, but I'm including the ones that's very applicable to our energy dynamics, right? And I want to go through this quickly so we're looking at green hydrogen that needs renewable energy and water to take into an electrolyzer to produce that green hydrogen. That goes into a few applications. The one I'm showing here that's relevant to us is hydrogen vehicles, and specifically the relevance of the mine haul trucks, which you know that Anglo is piloting. But also another relevant area is directly into green steel feedstock. So this goes directly into the process, right? If I could just move this away, sorry. Then we're looking at the hydrogen. That's a direct use, but then it can also go into chemicals production, specifically ammonia, and via the Fischer-Tropsch manufacture of methanol, sustainable methanol, and sustainable aviation fuel. So if you look at the ammonia line, there you can look at fertilizer production for domestic applications, and I'll mention later why that's so important, but also as an energy carrier, and this looks at the export and the export market for green ammonia. So we're using the ammonia as a transporting medium for the hydrogen, because the fact that transportation of hydrogen itself is very costly. It'll go into marine bunkering, that's fuels for ships. And then similarly, if you look at the next line, where we need to also source sustainable carbon together with green hydrogen to produce either your sustainable methanol or e-methanol and the sustainable aviation fuel. Now, e-methanol will also go in as exports for energy carriers, or it can go into marine bunkering of fuels for ships. Another important component which we will see is in the commercialization strategy is this area, which is the manufacture of equipment. Then that includes specifically both fuel cells and electrolyzers, but more, as we'll discuss later. So why are we doing this, and what opportunity does it present for us? And it's also important to align around the why, because there are challenges, as I will show in the next slide. It's firstly a market-driven commercialization. So it's not something that we woke up and decided to do, but it's driven by the market. Okay, and there's numbers out there about what Japan wants to import and what the EU wants to import, which is very encouraging for us as a nation who can produce and export. In addition to that, it's an industrialization opportunity, and this talks to the previous slide where I show the cross-sectorial impact, right, with the different industries. And that brings out the industrialization opportunities for us, and together with that, the infrastructure bill. So all of that was taken into our commercialization strategy to quantify our targets, ramping up from now to 2050, and into a macroeconomic model to quantify the impact on the GDP and jobs. And these are conservative numbers, and I'll explain why. But here you see the impact. And at the bottom right here, which we also talk much about, but it is a decarbonization opportunity, really, because of it's not only that because of the fact that it actually can go into industrial processes and do more than renewable energy. So at the bottom, we need to ensure that while we're doing all of this, we design this so we get the socioeconomic aspects also right from the start. That includes supporting of the previously disadvantaged groups. Quickly on this slide, you may have seen this before, but we do have the structural competitive advantages. That's a renewable energy capability, the land availability, and what can differentiate us are these two, which is the proprietary Fischer-Tropsch technology. And the reason that's important is because of what I explained in the value chain chart, and the same for PGMs. Okay, so there are challenges, and let's not be oblivious to this. And so we needed to understand these challenges and design our way out of this via the commercialization strategy, right? So there's a green premium, firstly. So all those products that we are going to produce will be at a premium price compared to the gray alternatives. And we need to understand, how do we get those business cases to work? There's an awareness issue about a lack of understanding of hydrogen, the confusion about electricity for hydrogen, hydrogen for electricity, that we need to understand better. And that links up to energy security and not competing with electrons to address the energy crisis, a key comment that came out of the public consultation. Also policy alignment and having government speak as one voice, and similarly around national infrastructure coordination on the infrastructure required. Funding is also another challenge that we need to address because of the quantum. Remember that we need a lot of money from now to 2050, but it's not only quantum, but types of funding. Then we've got the transportation cost, and it's a known fact that transporting hydrogen itself is expensive. but we're not doing that, just remember. And finally, the misconception about the water intensivity. The fact that we need water doesn't mean we need a lot of it, and I'll explain a bit more on that later. So here's your commercialization strategy in a nutshell, the 6 key elements. And firstly, targeting export is important, and that is going to help address the green premium that I mentioned. And the reason why is because we got price subsidies, and these real price subsidies, first bid from H2 Global went out to the market in December last year. So we need to make use of those price subsidies to our exports project, and that will allow us to create the industry. In parallel, we also need to stimulate the domestic market, but there we can look at those low-hanging fruit opportunities that may not necessarily be driven by price parity. And there's interesting examples. There's green steel driven by CBAM, right? So if we don't green our steel, our exports will be threatened. Fertilizer is another example, because there the business case is dependent on how you compare that with very expensive imports and your ability now to produce greener products, which is actually cheaper. And over the years, as the prices do drop, then we can look at penetration in other industries in the country. So that's, these two components are, crucial to work together. So localization, for a number of reasons, is important. One, its ability to bring prices down if you do manufacture locally and impact that. But at the same time, its ability to have the knock-on multiplier effect on the socioeconomic aspects, which I'll come to later. Securing financing, as I mentioned, is crowding in, but also all those grants and concessional debt and contract for difference, and where and when it needs to be used. And finally, at the bottom is that in conducive environment that I think Rebecca also mentioned, in government creating the conducive environment by changing policy and regulatory support, and potentially incentives in the future to support this industry. In a nutshell, and quickly on this slide, so these are some of the numbers for the export market: 4 to 8 million tons by 2050, domestic 3 to 6 million tons. So that's a minimum of 7 that we're targeting. And that's a number that we use to estimate the knock-on impact on socioeconomic and macroeconomic, right? But look at the upside is actually double that. 6 plus 8 is 14. So those numbers I showed you potentially can be doubled. Infrastructure, quickly also, we need those 3 key infrastructure, the transmission grid, and that entails how the hydrogen projects can connect up to the grid. But ports also important as part of the export strategy. And then in a very longer term, how would we transport hydrogen internally? Do we need to look at a pipeline specifically from our production hubs at the coast to the demand hubs inland? Skills is a key enabler, and we've done a lot of work in the commercialization strategy. So I'm not going to go into the detail, but you can see some of the detail here. We've identified what skills and what's the next steps in these areas. So you're welcome to look at the document for further detail in this regards. And the social impact, which is also a key. I think here we need to realize that our industries, the carbon-intensive industries, is at a threat if we don't decarbonize, the so-called hard-to-abate sectors. So green hydrogen, as I showed, in that value chain, will accelerate decarbonization of these heavy industries, and thereby also protecting those local jobs. So the energy security priorities is very important. And there's concerns that we're competing with electricity that's addressing the electricity crisis. At the outset, that will not happen. So there will be no competition for electrons, right? The other thing is the timing issue, where the green hydrogen projects will only come online after 2025, 2026, giving us sufficient time to address the electricity shortfall. In fact, green hydrogen projects can actually feed back into the grid because they're oversized, and the curtailed energy can actually feed back. And in doing so, can also supply electricity to communities. And finally, what we've realized, and this is the importance of developing these projects, is that these green hydrogen projects will pay for the grid infrastructure. But that infrastructure is not only for the green hydrogen projects, but will allow other renewable energy projects to connect. And these are those projects in round 5 that were rejected because of no grid connection. They will also be allowed to connect, and thereby also contributing to feeding into the grid. And I think lastly, we're looking at this as a play on the energy security longer term because of the play with the chemical production and not just electricity. The water issue, we quantified this, and those numbers that are showed in terms of targets means that compared to our SA water demand, it's less than actually 0.5%. So that's one important fact. Secondly, CSR did some studies also. The percentage impact of desalination on the cost is between 1 to 2%. Right, so that means 1 to 2% of the cost of green hydrogen production is made up of the desalination, which is very small. And that paper that I'm mentioning of CSIR also recommends desalination be oversized by 300%, and you provide that excess water to communities. And also inland, there's we're looking at the feed water can be treated from heavily contaminated sources, which is not treatable by municipal wastewater, such as mine water and acid mine drainage. These are the public consultation concerns in a nutshell, that when we went out in December, and this is a summary of some of the themes, there were quite a lot, but just a summary to give you an indication of where the concerns were. There was an energy security concern, which I touched on, the funding, workforce skills, transparency around process going forward, and lack of coordination around infrastructure. These concerns were then addressed in the updated document that was taken to Cabinet this week. So we have a number of next steps and detailed roadmap in the commercialization strategy, but these targeting the next 5 years, 2023 to 2027, are shown here. It goes along the policy and regulatory aspects and who needs to do what, the funding aspects, what needs to happen around infrastructure, the important role that project development plays, and then social dialogue and skilling. I think I want to end on a high note by showing you that this is a tangible thing. It's not pie in the sky stuff. These projects, these are the 9 projects that were given sub status. And as Rebecca said, we've seen progress, especially at the Green Hydrogen Summit that was held this week. And also I want to just show you some pictures quickly. We've got the green ammonia production for export. There's a Hive project in Kuka. This is one of the few projects that's doing ammonia for export. We've also got fuel cell manufacturing in the Vaal. We've got the green steel production, and I mentioned the importance of that, and that pre-feasibility study is progressing on this one. And we've also got the SASL Sustainable Aviation Fuel, not just SASL, but a consortium that's developing it. So thank you, Joanne. I do hope I stuck to time, but I think we believe that this green hydrogen economy presents a new opportunities for South Africa for energy security, economic development, skills development, employment, and community participation. Thank you very much, and let's open for questions when we're ready. Cheers. Thanks.
Thanks. Thank you very much, Mahendra. I think that was a very useful overview, including I think of where we are at the moment. There are multiple questions in the chat about whether you're going to get the documents. Yes, you are. All of the PCC, the documents will be put up on the website. I think there was a message from Simpiwe earlier on, so you don't need to worry about that. And then I'm going to ask the panelists, all of them, to just take a look at, please, can you put your questions rather in the Q&A than in the chat, so that we can look at all of them in one place. And the panelists, and then we'll also come back to Rebecca and Mahendra as well in that process. We'll try and respond to the issues that you are raising. I now want to hand over, and I hope he is online, to Commissioner Bobby Peake, who is a commissioner in the Presidential Climate Commission who represents civil society. He is a director of the Groundwork Organization. And I think that there have been, in the PCC context, quite significant concerns voiced from civil society around the green hydrogen economy and the developments and government's approach, and in particular to what extent it does or doesn't embody a just transition approach. And I think a concern in particular about benefits, process and benefits, so the justice issues. Bobby, are you online? I'm hoping you are. Oh, fabulous. I got a message from Bobby that he's not feeling so well today. So it's great that you are online, and can I hand over you to reflect some of the issues and concerns from civil society.
Yeah, thanks, Joanne. And I know that you want us to be having a full conversation on the hour, so I'll try and be brief. Yeah, good morning to the commissioners, fellow commissioners and participants, and fellow panelists. And specifically, Joanne, you know, probably knows better than anyone in this room where civil society departs from on the issue, considering a long history of engaging with us on environmental justice issues in the first, you know, part of our democracy. Before I start, I think I would like for us to just pause for a moment on Palestine. I would also like to, you know, put on the table here is to ask the president and ask the PCC, can we have a just transition if those responsible for the murder of 21 Abashlali Basamanjondola members have not been brought to justice? If Babita Diokaran, the former chief director, Gauteng Health, if Ma'am Fakile Nchangasa, a resident in the coal mining area, and Bazooka Radebe, an activist opposing the proposed titanium mining, if the killers of those people are not brought to book, we won't have a just transition. At the outset, I must say that the PCC is not the democratic space for green hydrogen debate. The space is government's responsibility, and government needs to do that. We are not government. As our chair says, we are a persuasive body. We can open some spaces, and thanks to the PCC for doing this today. Noting that Labour is not talking, and I'm the only civil society voice amongst a variety of industrialists. And also noting that there's clearly loads of hype on this because there's conferences left, right, and center. The horse has bolted. Civil society's voice is nowhere. And, you know, the government is talking, but where are people? And we need to recognize that the Just Transition Framework did not endorse green hydrogen, it referred to green hydrogen. And that's really important to understand. And we need to recognize who is the public, you know, because we haven't heard from the public. On the issue of green hydrogen today, it reminds me of a process, a T-shirt that I saw recently, worn by an African, and it's a Trump T-shirt. It says, "Get on board the Trump train or get run over." Today, I feel a bit like this about green hydrogen. If we don't get on board, we're going to be run over. But I'm not going to be run over. I have to think carefully about how to respond to this from the recent past. As recent as this week, we all know what has happened. And the distance past as far as 20 years ago. In a presentation I did to the advancement of journalism in 2008, I raised the issue of participation, transparency, and access to information, and access to justice and redress. I feel at one level so little has changed in the last 20 years because these are the demands we still make. And today I want to revisit the debate of the past 20 years and speak about these three issues in my short time to respond. The PCC's Just Transition Principles, and understand if this is met with the present mainlining into one's veins of green hydrogen in South Africa. We have to consider the impact on society through the analysis that we've done with people on the ground. And this analysis looks at externalization, enclosure, and exclusion. And finally, I think we need to talk about what type of industrial strategy must be delivered. On the JET principles, I think it's important to rephrase them here. Many of you would know that. We spent time as the Presidential Climate Commission to look at this. And we have to ask, does green hydrogen meet the principles of distributive justice and equitable distribution of risk and responsibilities that the direct impacts resulting from the transition and exactly from green hydrogen? As noted above, a successful transition necessitates an all of society approach, not only government and industry. So this distribution must cover all levels of government, corporates, and citizens. Restorative justice, the historical damages, the redress of those damages against individuals and communities and the environment, with the goal of rectifying and doing away with the situations of harm and of disfranchising communities. Does green hydrogen do this? Procedural justice, empowering and not only supporting people and workers and communities and small businesses to define the development. They haven't defined green hydrogen, it's been defined by somebody else, and the livelihoods in that transition. And being able to incorporate those processes into government processes, corporates, and how citizens respond. What we have here as cabinet, as approved this week, is the green hydrogen commercialization strategy, with the goal of positioning South Africa as a major producer and exporter of green hydrogen. And I want to underline that, exporter of green hydrogen. Is this a process that is in contradiction with the just transition principles, is what I asked today. And it is interesting how the Business Day editorial today says, and I quote, the self-congratulatory atmosphere at the Africa Energy Week in Cape Town was stifling. But given the delegates that were there to explain why Africa must and shall exploit its yet untapped fossil fuel reserves, climate change must be damned. One must assume some suffocation by propaganda was right on theme. Now, I know this is the Energy Summit, but it feels to me that this editorial could be written about the Green Hydrogen Summit. So that's really important. On the second issue of impact on society, it is our experience from a brutal past of the mineral and energy complex. It has delivered three things. It has delivered externalization, where people are polluted, the environments are degraded, and labor is coerced to force for less than its cost to live. Corporations get a free ride by offloading cost onto community, workers, public purse, and the environment. The second thing that the MEC has done, it has enclosed South African. Process of enclosure, where people are dispossessed and common or public goods are privatized. Capital eliminates or subordinates non-capitalist systems, so ensuring that all escape routes are closed and all we can survive on is what the market will give us, what capitalism will give us, what green hydrogen will give us. An exclusion, where people are excluded from the political and economic decisions that lead to them being polluted or dispossessed, so they cannot dispute this. And so this is how I feel this week of intensity that has hit us on green hydrogen. This is what is happening with the green hydrogen push. We must remember, at a broader political level, that power in the global economy is increasingly concentrated under a neoliberal order since the 80s, increasing financialization, unequal and volatile. Market concentration in South Africa is particularly marked within the dominant minerals and energy complex, created by imperial capital in the 20th century, and combining state and private entities, it has shaped development for over a century. It requires cheap labor and land, secures through dispossession, and the reproduction of a patriarchal and authoritarian relationship with society. In response, the open democracy agenda was articulated through the anti-apartheid movement, but only partially realized in the Constitution in '96. But that MEC is how I'm feeling green hydrogen is hitting us. We understand that the green hydrogen, and as was just said earlier on, is market-driven. It's not societal-driven. So finally, Joanne, I know I'm spending a lot of time, but being the only civil society person today, I'm going to take advantage on the way forward. Something we wrote in 2004 after speaking to people living next to oil refineries, people living next to coal fields, workers. We need an industrialization strategy, not a green hydrogen strategy, not a fracking strategy. That's extractive. We need an industrialization strategy that is for the local, for the province, for the national, and then only responds to the global. Yes, it all works together, but the objective has to be to deliver to people that are losing their jobs next to the oil refineries and coal fields today. So in 2004, we said, after working with communities and workers, that an industrial strategy has to shift the economy towards environmental justice that achieves standard of living that is decent for all. Some elements are the following, I say. People working for reasonable remuneration, rather than the dehumanizing ways in which we work today in South Africa, many millions of people. Communities that have decent levels of affordable basic services and infrastructure. Individuals and families access to minimum basic goods of human life, starting with food and safe accommodation, and clean and healthy environments where people live and work. And this is also nurtured with the way people live and work. Is green hydrogen going to deliver this, or respond to the power that you guys have said, the power of the global economy that is held by a few? We must abandon the belief in and subsidize support for export-led economic growth in South Africa in favor of local basic needs as a basis of development. And in conclusion, there are many platforms and spaces where all of this has been questioned. There's the Life After Coal platform, there's the H2 Watch South African platform, international platforms like Friends of the Earth International, and many more. Those in power choose who to listen to, and I'm afraid they're not listening to those platforms and those people. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Thanks for that, Bobby. I think that brought together. I think all of the views that have been expressed in a multitude of PCC forums around green hydrogen. What we are going to do now is to hear from three panelists who are involved in the development of the green hydrogen industry in South Africa. It's Heather Son from Gamiro Investment Group, Rilette Davidson, who's the head of the hydrogen program management at Sasol, and Mr. Patrick Stan Kayempe from Enetrag and Hyphen Hydrogen, who will specifically also look at the Namibian experience. And I'm hoping, and also just for you, Mahendra, and you, Rebecca, I think it would be useful to consider the issues that are being raised by Bobby. I don't think this dialogue is exclusively to respond to those issues, but I think that there are important issues. And looking at the questions that are being posed in the chat, I think there is a sort of sense of a kind of some of what is being said on the chat is it this or is it that? And I would really like to understand from each of you how you see your investments and your initiatives either being able to or not being able to take on board some of these issues, and what have you done at this point in time? So let me start with Heather. Welcome, Heather, and if you can keep it as short as possible. I would really like, my aim is to try and get the panelists to be finished just after 12 in their initial inputs, and then we can have almost a full hour for discussion, including for questions and contributions from the audience. So Heather, over to you.
Okay. Thank you. Thanks, Joanne. And it's hard to go after Bobby and not respond to Bobby. So I'm going to do my best to keep the comments specific to the project and what we are doing as a developer, but also to perhaps touch on some of the points that Bobby raises and leave enough time for my other panelists to make their comments and to end before just at 12. Yeah, I think this certainly, I think, Bobby, just to thank you for the role that you play, and that you play so unapologetically and so eloquently by putting forward the issues, because I think what we face is we kind of inherited a system where we business people, civil society, government, and we're all trying to play our role to the best of our ability towards a bigger mission. But it's really just impossible to be just a business person. You almost have to be a business person and care. and you've got to give capital a conscience. And I think you do that when you raise your issues, but the challenge becomes, how do we take those issues and actually build them into what it is that we're trying to do? I think one option is to stop everything and to go back to what is being proposed, start at a grassroots level, try to understand what the issues are and what our energy complex should look like. Or we take the opportunities that we've got, being mindful of what we need to address while we do that, and hopefully do something simultaneously that delivers into our country and our economy what we need, and hopefully over time starts to have a uniquely South African flavor. So we're not just taking on something which is being driven by a global market, but we are thinking all the time about how to shape it for our own particular circumstances. So, I mean, my company is Gamiro Investment Group, and we are strategic partner to one of the strategic infrastructure projects, which is Atlantia Green Hydrogen. And we are developing a green hydrogen project at scale for export, using as what was highlighted before, the premium that is available to early movers in a sector, so that we can help to bring South Africa into this global supply of hydrogen, but mindful of using hydrogen to catalyze the local market as well. I think the challenge that we face is that the science on global warming is complete. I think you can decide where you stand in that debate, but certainly the fact that the effects of global warming is felt is real. And how the world responds to that is where we find ourselves today, with Europe discovering that it will not reach its net zero targets if it does not employ green hydrogen in its energy mix. So what does that mean? It essentially means that countries in the global south that have the resources trap their electrons in some stable form, which is hydrogen. Hydrogen in a stable form is ammonia, which can then be shipped over vast differences. So essentially what we are doing is we are trapping our resources into a stable form and sending them across the oceans, where it will then be cracked and used in another economy. So if you look at it coldly like that, there are lots of arguments that need to arise. The challenge for South Africa is to say, if we do have these resources, can we collect the premium? Can we use it to the benefit of our economy? And can we do it in such a coordinated and with conscience way that it has a benefit beyond just to a few individuals and to a very small scope? So the way that we've tried to answer all these questions simultaneously is to develop, and it was our decision initially to develop in the Freeport Saldanha. So we are located there. We have a land allocation in Freeport Saldanha. And one of the earliest conversations we had was with the Minister of Infrastructure. It was still Patricia de Lille. And she said to us, as we were engaging with the municipality, she said, please don't stop at the municipality. Please go down to community level. And the department will assist with those engagements. So I think on what it is that we are trying to do is to engage at that local level with the municipality and with the municipal manager to understand some of the pains. We've got a lot of lessons learned from the renewable energy sector, and we can employ those to not repeat, and to find some solution together. And then at a community level, we are looking to find the most effective way of doing that. It is about being true to our mandate to deliver a project that actually can be bankable and can be commercially viable, but then to find the way in which to deliver the social returns as well. And having participated in the renewable energy sector, I think there are a lot of lessons learned, and I think we must use those to come to bear on the hydrogen sector. I think the way that we do this is that we do this in communication with each other and being willing to be moved. And I think all projects need to consider need to consider the solution in consultation, conversation, solution finding together with the broader stakeholder grouping, and that's what we are trying to do. I'll leave it there. Thanks, Joanne.
Thank you very much. Thanks very much for that, Heather. I'm going to, without further ado, go and ask Rolette Davidson to come in and talk a little bit about Sasol's approach in relation to its green hydrogen development and the strategy that informs that. Rolette?
Thank you very much, Joanne. I just want to check, am I audible?
Yes, you are, and we can see you.
Perfect. Thank you. I really, Heather, thank you for also doing that introduction, because I think it just, it hits close to home as well. You can't only be a business person, you're also a mother, you're also a daughter, you also come from a community, which is actually why green hydrogen is so close to my heart. I come from the Northern Cape, and so having the opportunity to work on our Northern Cape development is really for me something that I've also always aspired to, something you can teach your children about one day. So yes, my name is Rolette Davison. I work on the hydrogen program management for Sasol. I've been with Sasol for 20 years, so I've seen the company go through many phases and developments, and so I'm really excited to be witness to this transition to a sustainable future Sasol. So when we look at Sasol, I think everyone knows we're the second largest emitter in South Africa, but perhaps not as well known, as we contribute about 5% to South Africa's GDP. And if we look at indirect, direct, and induced jobs, because we've got such integrated value chains, we actually impact about 450,000 livelihoods in South Africa. So that is why for Sasol, it's so important that we actually do this transition in a just way, a responsible way. And to do that, we've crafted a multi-pronged strategy, but specifically to green hydrogen, which we're speaking about today. We're looking at not only incubating the local demand, we are looking at transitioning our own facilities, and then export projects do have a role to play. But the reason for that three-pronged approach is they really work interlinked. So if I start with the industrial transition, we all know that there are hard-to-abate sectors, which make it really difficult for electrification. And if I look at that, specifically the steel, transportation, fertilizer, for Sasol, we currently produce about 2.4 million tons per annum of grey hydrogen. So we're one of the largest producers of grey hydrogen in the world. We use that to produce fuels as well as chemicals. Now, one of the major applications of green hydrogen for a company like ourselves is if we are able to transition to a green hydrogen, and if we're able to then incorporate sustainable carbon feedstock, because FT is technology agnostic, we can use existing assets and the majority of our existing skill sets and people to transition the assets that we have in Sasolburg and Secunda, ensuring that part of the just transition. The type of volumes that we're looking at, though, if you think of it, 2.4 million tons per annum, that is immense. If we look at a 1.2 gigawatt electrolyzer facility, that's only going to produce about 120 to 150,000 tons per annum of hydrogen. So there's an enormous amount of investment required to get to that 2.4 million ton transition for Sasol. So as a result, what we're doing is in parallel to incubating for local application, we're also looking at developing projects for export. The reason for the export is that these projects, and we look at Boegoebaai, we look at Saldanha, specifically Boegoebaai, these projects have scale. So in the interim, while there are opportunities for subsidization and for potential mechanisms to help subsidize for the greenfield nature of these developments, we will export into a ready market for green ammonia, an existing market, and that de-risks the investment. But when you're developing a multi-billion-dollar development in the Northern Cape, just south of Alexander Bay, where there is literally nothing currently. You're going to be building a port, you're going to be building a SEZ, there's going to be housing, there's schools, there's hospitals. So that whole industry, even without local application of that molecule, impacts a significant industrialization of that region, which gives me goosebumps coming from the area and why that makes me excited. How we see that transitioning then towards 2035, 40, and 50 is that it has the scale potential to ultimately validate and motivate for the development then of large-scale backbone infrastructure for South Africa, both from electrification as well as from a pipeline infrastructure point of view, ultimately trying to also transition our own facilities and the jobs that entail. More recently, I would neglect if I didn't also mention, we've made a few announcements over the last few weeks. Of course, we've crystallized our relationship both with Toyota as well then as Air Products. Air Products currently do the cleaning as well as the pressurization of our grey hydrogen that we sell externally currently and don't use internally. That launch of the new Toyota Mirai was in the beginning of October, and that was to demonstrate how this new mobility sector could look for South Africa. It was also running on Sasol green hydrogen. So we have an existing chlor-alkali electrolyzer in our Sasolburg facilities, which we are systematically transitioning for green hydrogen production. And we started our first production there in June. So we're very excited about that. The second announcement that we made was then with BMW. And last week, we introduced the new iX5 BMW also in Cape Town. And BMW is really using this test case with both Sasol and Anglo to demonstrate whether this vehicle is actually a feasible solution for them as part of their longer-term strategy. And so it's exciting to also see something that you can go and touch and feel. It's not only a vision, it's not only something in the future. So we're working on it in multiple levels of application. Mahendra touched very, very briefly on why energy security is not impacted or is actually augmented by green hydrogen. I just want to give you an example. So in the Northern Cape, as you mentioned with the last bid window, you have enough renewable energy. What we did is we looked at both looking at exclusionary criteria for terrain, public settlements, where you can actually have a feasible renewable development. And we found that just on the solar, it has the capacity to develop up to 11,400 gigawatts of solar energy. Within the context of South Africa, that is amazing, but we cannot evacuate anything from the Northern Cape, so the grid is constrained. By doing this by development, phase 2 and 3 and 4 will justify the economic viability of developing those super high voltage grid infrastructure that can actually then unlock that renewable energy, not just for the project, but for South Africa. And if we look at what one of the speakers also said, with green hydrogen, your overbuild is 2 to 3 times. So all of that curtailed electricity can then also be fed back into the grid. And then if we look at mechanisms such as for example, Red EU currently is a little bit stringent with regards to temporal correlation. So you have to use your molecule or your electron within an hour of production. But if that is relaxed slightly, you can even use the grid more effectively, almost as a battery. And that will unlock even more electrons into the grid. So for us, we really see it as a complementary development for South Africa. It goes hand in hand. We have a significant role for renewable energy as part of the transition of our existing facilities in Sasolburg and Secunda. And you would have seen with ETHREAP, that program that's been followed by Sasol and the renewable energy we're bringing in. However, there is a role for green hydrogen as well, especially when we look at these large-scale industrial activities, hard-to-abate sectors, and then the added benefit of when you're going and developing this in a place like the Northern Cape, you are creating a whole new industrial base, a whole new opportunity for job creation, and then all the spillover effects of building infrastructure such as a port, a railway, updating also the road infrastructure. Joanne, maybe just the last thing. There's lots I can add because we've got such a extensive portfolio in Sasol. Of course, we're also doing the sustainable aviation fuels. We're also working with the SEZs on power generation. But the last thing about the Northern Cape, which of course has this enormous potential, is that we also fed some of the work that we did as part of our feasibility studies into the creation of what the Northern Cape also launched over the weekend, which is the Northern Cape Green Hydrogen Master Plan. And I'm very happy just to pop the link to that master plan also in the chat. I would encourage you to also look at that, because the intent was to try and make the process much more transparent, to identify which of the value chain opportunities are ready that can be ring-fenced, which ones need to be incubated, and which ones are in between. It also looks at what are some of those industries that can be unlocked. It looks at some of the governance profiles and platforms that will be put in place. And of course, also just to speak about the community engagement, we've had quite a significant amount of engagement via that master plan process with communities, renewable energy developers, and also other interested parties, both from a regional, national level. And so that process is not static. It has to be continuously run, updated, and that processes have been put in place so that we can ensure that dialogue continues. But it is not a bulletproof solution. And so what I really enjoy, this is my first PCC engagement, is just to hear the voices so that we also can understand where we are potentially not addressing sufficiently some of the concerns, or really looking at some of the blind spots we might have as a private company. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thanks very much, Renette. And it's very, very interesting to hear the entire strategy being reflected in one presentation. Can we move on to Patrick to talk about what is happening in Namibia in relation to green hydrogen? And he is from Inatrag and Hyphen Hydrogen.
Great, thank you, Joanne, and nice to meet you, everybody. Good to be here for the first time as well. I believe it probably makes sense to start with a little bit of an introduction on how this project in the Namibian hydrogen sector came about. So start with the world review, and then narrow in on Namibia, and then narrow in on the Hyphen project, because that, I think, gives the best context. The world, so this is not a market-driven economy, right? If you wanted to generate energy in Europe at the cheapest cost, you would do something else. But the world has decided that at the Paris, with the Paris Agreement, that this is the right way to do. So currently, this is not a market-driven approach, and there's no market for green ammonia of the sort that Hyphen is producing. Currently, there's not a single company in the world that will write, an offtake agreement over 15 years for a project like ours today. So it is, by definition, a collaboration between the heavy emitters of the global north, the industrialized countries, and the countries that have a lot of production potential, like Namibia and South Africa and Australia and Chile and so on. And I'm talking now about the big four export projects. There's obviously also local decarbonization required. So this is an industry where it is cheaper to produce the green hydrogen and green ammonia in Namibia and transport it to Europe and Japan and Korea and so on, than producing it in Europe and Japan themselves. And therefore, it's an industry where that global north, industrialized north, is going to pay for industrialization activities in the global south. And hopefully, but I think that all signs are positive, doing that, with the highest standards of ESG and in a fair partnership with the producing countries. We believe that is where the journey is going, because you will not get, as a project like ours, you will not get financing from global, you will not get an offtake agreement which needs sovereign support from governments, let's say in Germany and Japan, if you're not adhering to local laws and local standards, if you're not meeting socioeconomic requirements in the producing countries, and you will not get financing because the financing will also apply very high ESG criteria. Now, that is the starting point. The world needs about 2,000 projects of hyphen size. I'm going to get to hyphen size in a second. So many projects are needed, of which 50 to 70 could exist in Namibia, and a bigger number even in South Africa, given the available land. And that creates an enormous employment and socioeconomic development opportunity. So hyphen is really the first gigawatt scale project in Namibia. Namibia has a number of other hydrogen projects, and it's come about as part of an RFP that the Namibian government has put in place in 2021. So the Namibian government decided to implement its hydrogen industry in 2020 as part of its national development plan and the so-called Harambee Development Prosperity Plan. So this integrates nicely in the development plans of the country, and the government then implemented a governance structure, including the Green Hydrogen Council, which is a subcommittee of cabinet with I think 6-7 ministers representative of the Green Hydrogen Council, and a number of technocrats as well. The Green Hydrogen Council then has commissioned a hydrogen strategy for the country, which includes for export projects, and less so, because this is a different situation from South Africa, less so domestic projects. Why? Because Namibia is only consuming about 4.5 terawatt hours of electricity. Our project alone is going to generate 38 terawatt hours of electricity, about 10 times what the whole country needs. So there is no local market, or let's say from our perspective, big projects perspective, there's no significant decarbonization opportunity in Namibia. So Namibia is not facing the same question that South Africa is facing in terms of local projects, whether it's for export projects. So Namibia has decided to identify 3 hydrogen valleys. The first one being the Southern Corridor Development Initiative in the south, and it started in 2021, a request for proposal that a whole range of I think 9 developers participated in, and Hyphen was selected as the preferred bidder. And for more than a year, then we engaged in formalization of this award. And in May 2020 of this year, 2023, we were able to conclude the first concession agreement with the Namibian government. That concession agreement is a major milestone in the development of the hydrogen market, because it basically cements the boundary conditions for developing and operating a hydrogen project in Namibia, including fiscal, so tax questions, duties, labor laws, all kinds of land access, and so on. So all elements that are required to determine the commercial operation of a project like ours are already fixed. But it also is a benchmark and an earmark for the ongoing sectorial legislation. That's how it's called. That's how the hydrogen legislation is called in Namibia. And there's a very strong push by the Namibian government to put in place a green hydrogen legal framework that will allow both hydrogen projects for export and domestic hydrogen projects to operate in a clear regulatory and very competitive environment. Hyphen itself is a joint venture between 2 shareholders, Enertrak being the controlling shareholder and the Nicholas Holdings financial investor. The project is, as I mentioned, located in the south of Namibia, in the Salkap National Park, on about 4,000 square kilometers. The Salkap National Park is 26,000 square kilometers in total. So there's another, 8 or 9 projects of similar size possible in that area, subject to environmental limitations, because it is an area. It's called the former Sperrgebiet, that is pristine. It's been shut off from the public for many years for diamond mining purposes. But because it has been shut off, it's also developed, it's also been untouched, and therefore needs to be developed in a very sensible way regarding the environment. Maybe to give you an impression of what we're building here in that area, so we're building about 7 gigawatts of renewables, 3 gigawatts of electrolyzers. It's a project that requires an investment in the order of magnitude of Namibia's GDP of about $10–12 billion. At the end of our, what we call phase 2, we're going to produce 350,000 tons of green hydrogen per annum, which translates into 2 million tons of green ammonia. So that is about what one large steel plant would require. In Germany, it's about 2/3 of today's ammonia demand in Germany, noting that the demand in Germany will go up with the energy transition. That project will provide for 15,000 jobs in construction for 4 to 5 years, of which we are targeting to employ about 90% Namibians. That already speaks to the socioeconomic development opportunity. And it has the potential, we're targeting about 3,000 permanent jobs in Namibia, and that also targets Namibians in particular. So why is this an export? I mean, I already mentioned the export. The reason why this is an export project and not a domestic project, there's no market in Namibia, and there's also no connection to South Africa where you have a market, because South Africa emits 450 million tons of CO2, Namibia only 4 million tons of CO2, so it's just 1%. So the market for decarbonization exists in South Africa, but and there's obviously a lot of empty land available in Namibia. There's a lot of supply potential, but not a lot of demand potential. Now, there's another reason why we think that exporting is something that needs to do upfront, and I've seen it in Mahendra's presentation. I've seen it in some of the other comments that were made. I cannot comment on the conflict between the electricity supply and, or let's say, the power security in South Africa and those projects, but it is important to realize that the export to the industrialized North, Europe, Japan, and Korea, will come with support from these countries in terms of offtake guarantees, financing support, and so on, that will make the production of this green hydrogen much cheaper. And as the cost is cheaper, the price is going to be at some point price a freely traded world market price. There will be more profit available and more economic benefit in the producing countries. It is very important in that context to note that we have Namibia as a partner in the project. So the government of Namibia is a 24% partner in our project, paying for 24% of all the expenses. So they are the beneficiary of not only taxes, royalties, land leases, but also of the equity proceeds if they come and when they come, and hopefully they will come at some point in time. That makes Namibia as a country a more than 50% recipient of the cash flows from the project. So this is not even including the salaries paid to employees. This is Namibia as a government, and Namibia as a government can then use these proceeds to reinvest in the development of the country. I think it's important to note that part of the concession agreement that we've concluded with the government is a socio-economic development framework, which includes employment, skills development, local procurement, enterprise and supply development, and so on. So it's all the good things that you want to have. And it's very important that it was very difficult to limit or let's say to restrain a project or potentially by way of putting in place restrictions and limitations on the project that would make it not bankable, to avoid that situation. So really what we agreed with government was, okay, we have targets that include the 90% employment on the 15,000 construction jobs and so on should be to Namibians. So we've got targets, and we are going to translate those targets into binding commitments through the feasibility period. A lot of studies that need to be done. So we need to look at what are the skills available in Namibia. What are the companies available in Namibia that can actually supply into the sector. And subject to that, we will agree on firm targets with the Namibian government. And all of that is being done with the bankability of the project in mind. Why is it so important? Because if you delayed or made a project impossible because of not meeting the socio-economic development commitments once they're firm, then there would be no employment and there would be no economic benefit. That is the one reason. The other reason is the quicker you can implement this industry. So this industry is a finite industry. By 2050, the world will hopefully be decarbonized. At that point in time, no new projects will be needed, right? And if, let's say, Namibia or South Africa had only built 50% of the potential projects that can be built here, then that will result in the in a lower socioeconomic development impact. So walking this journey and walking it quickly from a regulatory perspective is very important.
Okay, Patrick, can you begin to close up?
Yes. Maybe let me just wrap up in terms of what are the challenges in Namibia, and what are what can Hyphen deliver? So I think the challenges are Namibia doesn't have an infrastructure, for example, like South Africa. So the transmission lines are missing and so on. And the government is very small, also compared to South Africa. So we are constantly dealing with, let's say, a lack of capacity on the government side, but there's a lot of support available from, let's say, sovereign partners across the pond. So what can Hyphen deliver? Hyphen can be implemented rather quickly as the first mega project in Namibia, and therefore open up the industrialization opportunity in Namibia. Namibia is very, very scalable. Namibia has chosen a strategy of demonopolization. I think it's very important that countries should not depend, should avoid giving away large tracts of land to individual developers, but rather slice and dice so that there's healthy competition ongoing in the market. These projects are by definition big, at least the export projects, and as long as there are many of them, they'll compete with each other. The Namibian government has decided for a competitive tender approach to tendering its land, and that really creates that competition. So yeah, that's where we're at Hyphen. I think it's a good case study of how the government government of Namibia has realized an opportunity and is developing an industry with the end goal in mind, but also in respect of the needs of the population and the socioeconomic development requirements that have been defined. So there's a very clear journey for us in front of us.
Okay, thank you very much. And sorry to rush you, but I think that we do need time for discussion. There are 32 comments on the chat. I'm hoping that all of the panelists have been looking at them. Can I just, for a few seconds, some of the issues big issues that have been raised, issues around that I've picked up. I think there are questions around safety and regulatory frameworks, and I wonder if when we come on to the next round, Rebecca, if you could maybe address that. I think you did in your presentation start to engage with that, but I think a number of comments have been raised around the safety of it. The issues that have been raised around the viability of the transport sector as a sector that could be using green hydrogen. There are questions that have been raised. I think one of the big issue is that actually there is a terms of trade discussion. To what extent is this a kind of neo-imperialist ploy by the West? Or to what extent is there local benefit, and what are the terms of trade, and how do we address that? I think there are questions around beneficiation and the development of local value chains. There are questions about the ownership of those. And then there is a big question running through all of this about what does procedural justice really mean? a consultation versus something deeper and more fundamental, maybe, I think is part of that conversation. And then a question that hasn't really been asked, but I think is implicit in this, is what happens if we say, no, we don't want this? What would it mean for us? What would it mean for our existing industrial infrastructure as a country? Would it have any impact whatsoever, or not? And I'd be interested to hear the views on that. So that's just some of what I've picked up. I thought it might be useful for Rebecca to come in and talk in particular about the regulatory issues, in particular from the questions of health and safety. And then I think I'm going to open it to some questions and comments from the floor, and then we'll get each of the panelists to take 2 minutes to respond to key issues. Just on the question of information, because there are a lot of things saying, where's this document? Where's this document? I want to propose that as an outcome of this dialogue, that the PCC creates a repository of green hydrogen policy and other documents on its website. Going forward, the green hydrogen commercialization strategy, I know it was announced yesterday post-cabinet that it has now been approved, and I presume that the latest version is now available. And maybe Mahendra can also come in on that. But I think that access to information is quite an important part of this. And then there are a whole set of issues around the JET IP, which I'll try at the end to maybe give a very, very brief response to. Okay, so let's start with Rebecca. Then let's take a set of inputs from the floor, and then we will take the last 15 minutes for the panelists to come in again.
Okay.
Rebecca.
No, thanks, Joanne. Sorry, I had to move to another device because of I had lost power on my laptop. But in terms of the issues around regulations for health and safety, I think I want to make the case that, hydrogen is a gas, and it's currently used in refining chlor-alkali facilities. So we're currently using it now. The only difference is whether it's a gas, moving it from a gas to an energy vector. So there are existing regulation standards around safety. Even when you do deployments in South Africa, we're using those safety, those rules when we currently are using them. The only challenge is we start using it for, let's say, for instance, hydrogen in cars or vehicles. I mean, I know there's like hydrogen safety initiatives globally where they're looking at the use of hydrogen in cars through Europe. You have these tunnels that, has to escape. And I know at Northwest University, they're doing some work globally, partnering local and globally around how to use hydrogen in mines and mining vehicles. So I think we have the standards there and we have the safety regulations. The question is now when you start using it in new sectors, like in transport and so forth, we need to now make changes to the safety standards. I hope that answered your question, Joanne.
Okay, thank you. So, yeah, okay, thanks. I am wanting to know whether there is anybody who would like to make a comment. I think don't repeat the questions that you have put on the chat, but let's, Patrick, I'll give you an opportunity in a while. Let's rather hear from the floor at this point in time, give people an opportunity. And I don't see, okay, Lufuno Chikalanga Korombi, do you want to come in? I might need some help from the PCC team to identify whose hands are up. I'm just trying.
Thank you so much. Believe I've asked all my questions. I just have a request that if it is possible that, as you were saying earlier, that access to information is important because it helps us to engage fruitfully and meaningfully. So I just wanted to ask if we can have a document that address the green hydrogen project. How is it addressing issues of infrastructure and issues around imports? Because we need to be able to balance imports and exports, and we more into importing than exporting. How is it also addressing issues around unemployment? Is it going to contribute in any form or shape in terms of reducing unemployment? And how is it contribution to issues around localization? Because I guess for most of us, that's what just means. If there is contribution to the challenges that we currently have, and in what form and shape, and how far are we, then how do we then get to collaborate together as everybody who is interested in making our environment healthy and secured? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. Whose hand? I'm afraid I can't see the hand. Who's next?
It's Mlungisi.
I'll go next. Okay. I'll go next. Thank you.
From the Northern Cape.
Okay. Northern.
Okay, my question is specifically to Cecil. You know, in terms of the projects that you guys are rolling out, what percentage of your supply chain or your value chain are you guys involving youth and startups within the Northern Cape? And also, are you guys also assisting the youth in terms of skills training? Because hydrogen is particularly a technical industry, and how are you guys ensuring that the youth of the Northern Cape are involved in terms of skills development and also participating within your supply chain or value chain?
Okay, thank you. And I think that Heather might want to come in on that as well when we respond to it. There are another 2 questions. Then I'm going to give the panel an opportunity to respond or to pick up issues. Who's the next person?
So Selokgadi Mosehle can speak next, and then they will be followed by Cobus Tehran.
Okay.
Yes.
Thank you. My question is for Dr. Rithabile. I think I'd just like to find out what progress has been made since the development of HISA in terms of growing the local market for hydrogen use, because I think a lot of the focus has been about getting it out there, and we have seen some talks around the steel industry, which will impact the motor industry as a result. But what else is there that we are looking at to ensure that we are growing the economy, and not just for South Africa, but also across the continent, to ensure that we do have that collaborative plan as a continent before we venture into the world? Thank you.
Okay. Next one, I think it's Mr. Tehran.
Good morning. Thank you very much for the informative session. I just want to ask 3 questions that are all basically related. I'm from the Endangered Wildlife Trust, and we're just trying to get a better understanding of the potential footprint we see for the green hydrogen development, specifically on the West Coast region. Also, then, whether or not, is there a cumulative idea of all of the developments that are associated with this? Is there somewhere where we can see there's a harbor, there's the SEZ, there's, is there some kind of idea that we can gauge from that? And then also, very importantly, there's massive opportunity to develop some of these things within areas that have already been severely compromised by mining. So there's a real good fit here, in my opinion, rather than doing greenfields developments, to actually look at areas that have already been damaged there on the West Coast. If we can just have some comment on that. I'm not sure who would reply, but thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. I am going to suggest that firstly we take Mahendra to maybe talk on the broader issue of the overall scope and scale in the country strategy, and then that Relette that Relette then comes in to answer the Sasol specific question, followed by Heather, I think, who can talk about, in particular, about some of the issues on the West Coast and Saldanha. And then that Patrick comes in after that. And then Bobby, if you want an opportunity to then follow up. So Mahendra, let's start with you.
Okay, thank you, Joanne. So I think I'll comment. I know there's a lot of discussions about export and why we're looking at export market and the domestic play. And I think the first point is that both are important. But I think we need to look back at what I mentioned regarding the green premium, and green hydrogen prices are still to drop. And for that reason, the export market becomes important because we can make use of pricing subsidies. That's a way of us getting the industry kickstarted locally. I think there are opportunities in certain areas where you can have both at once, right? Specifically the offtake for steel and potentially an export in the Saldanha area as an example, right? But in parallel, the domestic, the market or domestic consumption is not deprioritized, but rather what we're saying is let's look at those low-hanging fruit opportunities first, because prices will drop. But what are those opportunities that's not dependent on price parity? And I mentioned, the CBAM impact on green steel and the possibility of a fertilizer because of expensive imports. And then there's the longer term strategy and scale is then dependent on also using local production of equipment. Because what it didn't show is that, there's a knock-on effect when you do influence the price of electrolyzers. Remember, those same electrolyzers produce green hydrogen, which thereby influences the price of green hydrogen, right? So that localization impact has an impact on the prices, but also obviously the socioeconomic benefits it brings. We have shown that by 2045, South Africa can reach the lowest cost globally, but there's a part to get there towards there, and that's what we're looking at now is how we bring all of that together, namely domestic, export, and localization. And then while one more thing on the document, Joanne, yes, so the approval was done at Cabinet on Wednesday. It will have to go through a process before we can release a final document for comments. We do realize and accept there's a lot of urgency to see the document, and we also have urgency to release it also. So we will put priority on that. Thank you.
Thanks very much, and we'll keep on pushing you on that as well. Okay, Relette then.
Thank you, Joanne. So with Sasol, I think we are privileged in that we have experience with developing projects in these areas where it's completely greenfields or very limited development. So if I think of how our roots started in Sasolburg, Secunda, what we've done in Mozambique, what we've done in EGTL in Nigeria, we also had a few difficult lessons that we learned along the way, but we have really learned the value of taking the community with us and looking at local content development, looking at what it means to actually grow with the industry and your fence line communities. So when we're looking at the Northern Cape, specifically to the question that was posed, of course, we are still doing our pre-feasibility study. So we haven't taken an FID yet on that project. So aligned with it, we do, however, acknowledge that this is an opportunity for us, given the timelines that you see with these mega projects, that you can really make a difference. Because sometimes when you look at the projects, there isn't enough time to do a really good job at incubation and getting the local industry established to move with your project. We have that opportunity here. So the approach that we took is we actually developed a 5-year strategy for our specific CSI initiatives, and it goes for short, medium, and long term, with a big focus on education and training as part of the short-term focus areas. So what we've already done is we already gave out bursaries for eligible candidates within the Northern Cape. We've also worked with the TVET colleges. We visited the TVET colleges. We are looking at their program. The intent is to ultimately have a program as part of the TVET colleges to actually look at training in hydrogen. And then we're also looking at leveraging some of the skills and experience in Sasol to coach and mentor and actually work with those colleges. In addition to that, of course, we as Sasol already have an eco hub that we have in Sasolburg that we leverage for this similar thing with our existing operations. Working with the Northern Cape, we have encouraged them to also look at a similar approach when it looks at their master plan. So we look at a SMME hub to be established as part of that master plan development. We're also looking there at what that support might be required, and also as investment criteria for companies in the SEZ to also commit towards that upliftment and the same targets that you would expect from a development in a responsible way, and actually taking the community with you. So again, all of that we've also tried to where and to the level of IP that we can share. We have incorporated it and shared it with the Northern Cape so that that can be incorporated in a transparent plan that's also open for comment and input. And maybe, Joanne, just a last little bit before we go on is we took a similar approach to the actual footprint of what these projects might have. And so what we've done is we've looked at the concept of an eco asset, and there's a lot of work that's busy happening currently that the Northern Cape are also engaging at a national level, where sometimes projects would do this by themselves, and then they all only do an offset strategy for a small piece of land. And ultimately that is also effective. But if you looked at it as an eco asset for that full development, for the opportunity for development in the Northern Cape, and you actually then went and had a combined approach towards the offsets for all of these different projects, and you developed an eco park, you spurred the tourism industry, you created additional jobs, you look at it from a holistic, more consolidated approach, the impact is so much higher and the benefit to community almost so much richer. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Heather, can you come in, and it would be good if you can respond specifically to the EWT question.
The EWC question in relation to the West Coast.
Yes, yeah.
Okay. Yes. Okay. So there is an industrial development zone on the West Coast, and that allows for a number of things, both from a conservation point of view, where EIAs have already passed a base level in that area, and the area has already been demarcated for industrial development. So that's very useful, just reflecting on Cobus's question. It's also useful because it's filtered through a central point through the Freeport Saldanha administration. So that is a coordinated, I think the name of the game here on everything we're talking about is how can all of these ideas be coordinated as best as possible through central points. So I think the IDZ and Freeport Saldanha allows for that. I've also been in some discussions about expanding the footprint of the IDZ, and that's a discussion with the municipality. So again, a coordinated approach as to how to expand and then to bring the conservation consideration into that conversation. So I think it's important for you to know that, Cobus. Then in terms of developing at a mining site, so this is not a new concept, and it's been done at scale by companies like Fortescue, the Australian company, in Djibouti, in Mauritania, in DRC, and so on, where they are putting up, they're using, I think the commitment there is $1 billion per year to create renewable energy sources to be able to make their processes, their mining processes green, which has the knock-on benefit that their exports are green. So this is happening. I think as far as South African mines are concerned, it has to be cost effective. So that's one consideration. And the cost of green hydrogen still has to come down. There's a broader broader debate whether to set electrolyzer, because the other consideration is where the resource is. So you've got to look at where the best renewable energy resource is, wind and solar, for where you put your renewable energy asset down, and then move it either across the grid with some constraints, move it across the grid to where you need it. There is some debate as to whether you should move molecules rather than electrons, which essentially means is that you put your electrolyzer where your renewable energy asset is, and then rather than use the grid, you use pipelines. So you put in pipeline infrastructure to move that. I think that's a ways off. It's an interesting conversation, but we need to get our projects up and running so that we're in the process, and then we can look at alternatives. But that should give you a little bit of a flavor for what some of the debates are and what some of the constraints are in terms of where you put down the electrolyzers and how you produce green hydrogen. There was just one question that came up earlier with infrastructure. And someone asked, how do we deal with infrastructure and the requirements for infrastructure? If you look at export, you're going to need ports. In Saldanha, there is a port. It has been highlighted as one for upgrade, and there is budget for it. The one thing that's not certain is whether there's budget for green hydrogen, for that green hydrogen specific infrastructure. But those are conversations that we have to go into, and we have to be sure that we are influencing. But most importantly, we have to have conversations together as competitors so that we don't compete where it's unnecessary. And here I'm looking at Sasol in particular, so that, all parties participate and we collaborate where it makes sense to do so. So where there's common use infrastructure required, we work together to do that. Where there are where there are opportunities to employ youth and to develop SMMEs and learn, for example, from Sasol's way of doing that in the past, we must collaborate to get that done. Thank you, Joanne.
Okay, thank you. And sorry to hurry you along. And I'm going to do exactly the same with Patrick, ask you to be very brief. There are still a couple of people who've got hands up, and I'm hoping we can have time to have a couple more questions and a response or two before we must close.
Thank you, Jen. I would like to address three questions. There were many questions. The first one is the environmental one. For me, that's the main limitation on the development of hydrogen. We don't want to decarbonize the world while destroying critical habitat or endangered species. That is important, right? We have to keep that in mind. I think the second point I wanted to comment on is employment. So the Namibian hydrogen industry, the 50 projects that I mentioned would lead to full employment in Namibia. So 200,000 jobs in wind and solar alone. That doesn't even include the electrolyzer, all the downstream and upstream activities. So very quickly, you're going to have full employment, which no other sector can achieve for Namibia. And it has a similar potential for South Africa as well. I think it's very important to note for South Africa that everybody knows this, but that the employment intensity of renewables and the hydrogen industry is higher than for the fossil fuel industries and nuclear industries, which don't require as much employment. So the benefit here is clearly for the population. And I think a third aspect is one that plays into the fears of being exploited, which I think are real. And I think all of us here in the room, I mean, I'm German national, but as my heart passionately beats for the economic interests of Namibia and South Africa in this. We need to negotiate with the global north in terms of what we're getting for the hydrogen, right? And that is a very important discussion to be had. That's happening. And I think but what I wanted to point out is what we need to achieve here, and that's why the speed of implementation and the governmental support, legislative support, regulatory support is so important, is to get to the lowest cost of hydrogen very quickly here in Namibia and in South Africa, because that will attract the industrialization of other sectors upstream and downstream. And I think Saldanha is the best example. There was a steel mill that was shut down a while ago, but now the green hydrogen industry, because of, you know, obviously power issues, right? If you have power cuts in a steel mill, that's not great, right? And but now with the hydrogen and renewable energy, you can revamp that steel mill. Now, just by way of example, a steel mill in Germany. Last comment, maybe just last sentence. The steel mill in Germany will have to buy 2 billion euros worth of hydrogen, you know, in order to decarbonize. It costs only 300 million euros to move that steel mill into Namibia or South Africa. Just keeping that in mind, right? So it's a very quick strategic decision for European and global industrial companies to move their production of energy-intensive industries to the locations where the cost of hydrogen is low. So if we achieve that, lowest cost of hydrogen in Southern Africa, then we will have a lot more industries coming here in the next 20, 30 years.
Thank you. And that's an important point. I mean, my own personal concern about this is really about the opportunities for local industry and for the development of a wide set of local industries that might otherwise have very uncertain futures. I have two more hands that I was informed of. I'm going to ask them to be extremely...
Just a quick response before we move on, just from my side.
Sorry, Bobby, I apologize.
No, Hassel, but very quickly. So I think Sasol's blurring green hydrogen with grey hydrogen and all that, and that is to keep the fossil fuel industry alive. So Sasol do with what you want to do with that statement. In terms of the lowest cost of hydrogen, are we talking about cheap labor? We also need to recognize that ESG actually means quite nothing in the South. Look at Medupi and Kusile. We said the World Bank said we'll give you money and we'll follow country standards. Both Medupi and Kusile has been a nightmare. So I think that's important to recognize. And then I think, you know, in terms of full employment, we have to ask the very important question, cost per job. So I might have my figures wrong here, but when they were trying to set up a third or fourth steel mill in South Africa about 15 years ago, the cost per job was $750,000 for one job versus the local economy, which creates so many more jobs with far less input of price. So I think, yeah, that's for me, Joanne.
Okay, thank you. I've gotten Tumbi Zodwa Ranyadi and then Leanne Govinsamy, and then we are going to close. And I'm hoping that there will be time for a response. I know there are another 5 hands in Piwe. We don't have the ability. I mean, you know, I always wondered whether 2 hours would be enough for this seminar. I think that we need at least 3 or 4 hours. And one of my recommendations is we have another follow-up session where we can go into some of this in a lot more detail. So, Ntombi Zodwa.
Okay, hi, Madam Chair. Hope everyone is okay. I'm Ntombi Zodwa Ranyadi from Soweto in an organization called Soweto Cultural Senior Citizens. And I'm also part of Women in Energy and Climate Change Forum, also the Grassroots for Action Climate Change. My question will be, in all of this green hydrogen gas, I would like to know what kind of transportation is going to be used. And also in terms of infrastructure, I think the pipes needs to be erected. So my question will be, the people who are staying next to those places that are going to be used, how safe are their homes to them? And in terms of growing this economy of South Africa and through the continent, somebody said that. So my question will be again, are the grassroots are the grassroots people part of that economy now, of what is going to happen? Because most of the things that most of the projects that are happening, they are happening through the grassroots level communities. Are we going to be part of those projects and part of upgrading the economy of our country? Or is it only the people who are going to benefit, those who are richer? Because in our countries, there's this saying that the richer will become richer, the poor will become the poorest. That is my concern. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ntombizodwa. And maybe Rebecca and I think Mahendra, if you could prepare a kind of 1 minute response to that. Leanne.
Thanks, Joanne. Joanne, I think you'd said you try to address the JET-P question. I'm not sure if there's time, but essentially the question around the inclusion of green hydrogen in the JET-P and in the JET-IP as opposed to, let's say, support for the SARM, which is probably more aligned. And I think there've been a number of different statements around the financing. A lot has been said about the need for grant financing, potentially to be mobilized under the JET-IP for green hydrogen. However, Mahendra has also responded to say, well, we need private finance. So I'm wondering whether private financiers are now in the business of providing grant finance. And I think, yeah, there are a number of questions that we've raised in the chat that haven't been answered. So also looking forward to some written responses and perhaps a summary of the questions and answers when you disclose the rest of the documents on the PCC website. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Can I, before I want to suggest, Mahendra, can you try and respond to a couple of those, and then Rebecca, and then we'll close on the JET-IP. Just to say that in the implementation plan that we are currently working on, we are seeing the SARM as a key area for mobilization of finance going forward. I think that at the point that the investment plan was written, SARM was not at a mature stage and not at the stage that it is now. And so we have identified going forward that there are particular areas where there needs to be significant work done and significant financing mobilization, and SARM is one of them. We see still that green hydrogen is a key element of a decarbonization drive in South Africa, and it was included in the Glasgow partnership. I think in that kind of context, I am aware that there is a lot of criticism from civil society about that, but it is in there. And just to say, to respond to the one issue in the chat, which is that you prioritizing green hydrogen over transmission, not so. The JET-IP has an allocation of 711 billion for the electricity sector, of which a large proportion of that is for transmission. So for the full transmission need that we would need to have in order for a decarbonized electricity system, and then the green hydrogen allocation is separate to that. So I don't think that we have sort of robbed Peter to pay Paul in the way that that has been set up, but it clearly does need a longer conversation, and I apologize for not being able to do that. Mahendra, and then we're going to give Rebecca the last word, and then I want to make some way forward suggestions.
Thank you. And Ntombizodwa has some, very important safety questions relating to the community. I think that's topmost on our minds. We have commenced with the SABS working committee, and the first priority is to address safety standards. So I think that's the first thing. When Ntombizodwa also asked about transportation, I think your first prize is to produce as close as possible to the demand. But if there's a need in the longer term for pipelines, etc., to be developed, all the necessary safety standards will be followed, ensuring that the proximity to communities, etc., is far away to avoid any risk. So that's a response to Ntombizodwa's safety issues. I think for Leanne, in connection with the private funders providing grants, I'm not sure if I understand the question properly, but the important part that private funders play is that during project development to risk the projects, that's where the private funders put in project development funding with a few other DFIs who also put in project development funding. So that's funding meant to de-risk the project. So I'm not sure if that answers Leanne's question, because she talks about how the private players can provide grant financing, which I'm not really sure about. But I'll just stop there. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Rebecca, do you want to add anything at this point, or can I then close and hand over to Dr. Crispian Olver to look at the way forward?
I'll be really quick. I just wanted to make the make the comment around the grassroots and the communications. Like I said, before a hydrogen project gets onto the ground, before it's funded or decisions made, prior to that, you need a lot of social scientists. You need lawyers to help close the deal. You need community communicators to make sure the community understands the implications of what's happening. So I think for me, this is where the grassroots community comes in around communication. And then also, I think last but not least, around issues of safety. I think it's important to be honest and transparent. Hydrogen is a gas, but you do also move hydrogen as part of ammonia or NH3. So there are concerns around safety, especially when it comes to the movement of ammonia, because it's a toxic. So I think as we do the safety components from certification and standards, it's important that we also look to ammonia, because we'll be moving part of the hydrogen as ammonia as well. So I just want to end there.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. I am going to hand over to the PCC Executive Director to close and show way forward. But I think this is, just from my own experience now of trying to facilitate this, I think this is the start of the conversation. So I'm certainly hoping, Dr. Olver, that you will give us some way forward that would enable the conversation to take forward. And I think a set of very fundamental and critical issues to be engaged with in a much deeper way, and in a way that really drives us forward and starts to build, I think, a stronger level of both understanding and hopefully through that a stronger level of consensus. So thank you, everyone. It was a privilege and a pleasure to facilitate this. And over to you, Crispian.
Thank you, Jo, and thank you for your expert facilitation. I have to say, it's been an absolute privilege to sit and listen to all the inputs today. I mean, what we've had in this room is a group of people that have really been at the forefront of making this green hydrogen economy a reality. And, you know, particularly I want to acknowledge Rebecca, who's been driving this thing in government for about 10 years. But also Mahendra, Heather, Rolette, Patrick, you know, to have people that are practically making this move forward in the conversation has been very important. I think on the other side, I mean, you heard probably most articulately put forward by Bobby, a set of very deep and real concerns from civil society and worker organizations. And the question that's being asked is this green hydrogen economy simply going to replicate the kind of capital-intensive, highly concentrated minerals energy complex we've had before, or is it going to be a real tool for transformation? And Bobby spelled out the three principles of the just transition, which I think, you know, we've got to use as a benchmark, as a way of measuring. So are we being procedurally just in the way that this gets implemented? Are people being taken along? Are we putting the right information out and ensuring equity of information? And are we hearing people and addressing their concerns? And where possible, building partners with them? And also, you know, is this going to contribute to restorative justice and distributive justice? So, you know, is this industry going to be a more decentralized, democratically owned, participatory industry that really brings benefits and jobs and contributes to the climate transition? So I think you've posed the challenge. And what we certainly have heard in the conversation today is that there's, you know, a lot of questions that haven't been answered. I was following the chat and the Q&A. I mean, I have to tell you, I've never seen so many questions in a Q&A. And the panel were addressing them as fast as they could. There were 46 questions that had been addressed and 30 that remained unanswered. So, I mean, first of all, well done to the panel for a superhuman effort in answering the questions that you could. But there's a lot that still needs to be talked about. And I've heard the recommendation, Joe, for follow-up engagement. We'll go back as the PCC and reflect on today's engagement, and we'll come back with a proposal. I mean, we've heard the request. Let us apply our minds and think about how best to structure that, and maybe also create a platform for an in-person engagement, because I think that'll allow us to get into a little bit more depth. I've also heard the request to set up a document repository, so we'll talk to our website team and we'll make sure not just the presentations and the information we talked about today, but a broader cross-section of all of the regulatory documents that you heard presented by Rebecca and others. So on that note, thank you to our panelists. You were a great team. Thank you, Joe, for facilitating. Thank you, Simpiwe, who did all the work in the background and held this thing together. You make us very proud as the PCC. And everyone that participated, thank you. It's your time and effort and holding us accountable and putting us on the spot that really counts. So thanks very much.
Thank you and goodbye, everybody.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.
Take care. Bye.